Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're taking you to Springfield, Massachusetts, where the Springfield Museums has created what is one of the most innovative and comprehensive witch trial exhibits in the United States.
Witch Panic, Massachusetts Before Salem tells the story of Hugh and Mary Parsons, whose 1650 to 1651 case represents the first true witch panic in what would become America.
You may remember Hugh and Mary from an episode we did with Malcolm Gaskell about his book, The Ruin of All Witches.
And we did another episode, just Sarah and I, to fill in the details of the Parsons story. So go check those out after this.
This isn't just another witch trial story. This story helped set the stage for everything that came after, including Salem. And what makes this exhibit so special is how it invites visitors to experience the story firsthand, even serving as members of the jury reviewing the evidence.
Our guest today is Elizabeth Kapp, Curator of History at the Springfield Museums, who has masterfully woven together local history, the humanity of the accused, and connections to our modern world.
So let's start this fascinating conversation about witch panic, banned books, and why the humanity of the accused matters more than ever. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Elizabeth. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your expertise and the place and location of your work.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I'm very honored to be here. My name is Elizabeth Kapp, and I am the Curator of History at the Springfield Museums in Springfield, Massachusetts. My background in terms of education is in history and art history, and I have a master's in history museum studies from the Cooperstown graduate program. And it's all of this passion in history about the stories from the past that have led me to be able to tell this story.
That's awesome. What would you like us and our audience to know about the Springfield Museums?
The Springfield Museum is actually a collection of 5 museums and a sculpture garden located in Springfield, Massachusetts. And so we have 2 different art museums, a science museum, the Amazing World of Dr. Seuss, and the Dr. Seuss Sculpture Garden as well. And then we have the Lyman and Mary Wood Museum of Springfield History, which is where this exhibit, Witch Panic, Massachusetts Before Salem, is located.
How did this exhibit, Witch Panic, come together?
Well, like all great projects, it was definitely a collaborative effort with my colleagues at the Springfield Museums across the board. But also the magic with history is the fact that it's building off of other people's work and research that has come before me. And it was working with my colleagues in the archives to find some materials that help shed light to the context of 1615 Springfield. It was working with my exhibits colleagues to make sure that we tell the story physically in a way that truly transports people as best as we can to 1650 Springfield and what life was like for the Parsons at that time. And so, yes, it was a collaborative process, and we're really proud of this outcome.
Thank you. Yeah, we've talked about the case of Hugh and Mary Parsons a couple times on the podcast, but it's been quite a long time. We're so excited to see this getting some more attention now. And what can you tell us about Witch Panic itself? What's in the exhibit? What can visitors expect?
This is actually the largest exhibit that the History Museum has put together ever since it opened in 2009. And as you guys are well aware, the history and the stories of witchcraft are extremely complicated and nuanced, where the details really add up and they matter. And they're a matter of life and death oftentimes. And with the story this interconnected and complex as the Parsons case, especially as it interplays with the story of William Pynchon and his banned book, The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption, it was important to take the space that we had to tell the stories, this layered story that we have. This exhibit actually spans 2 different floors of the History Museum. And because we have such a variety of museums, our audience is also very varied, so to speak. And so we wanted to make sure we had something for everyone, because everyone thinks they understand witches, no matter what age. And so there's that interest in just about everyone. And on the 2 floors, they explore different questions when it comes to witches. So on the first floor, we have a great big open hall that is organized in 4 different thematic areas. And in these areas, we explore the question, what is a witch? Because we all have our own understanding of what a witch is. And all of that is inspired by both the myth of and the fantastic nature of witchcraft, but it's also inspired by the real history. And the first floor explores this question by putting our guests in 1650s Springfield and exploring different aspects of life in the 1650s in this area. There's a space dedicated to a recreation of a kitchen in colonial Springfield with a live not quite live, but with a crackling fire. And there's a different area that explores the jobs that would have been common for the colonists to have. And then a different area dedicated to the colonists' relationship with the afterlife. But concluding this area, we thought it was important to bring the story up to the modern day. And so there's a section dedicated to the many witches of our pop culture and the witches of our world today. Because while most of us might think that witchcraft is something of history, there are many witches, and each of us has a favorite, and each of us has a reason why. So the first floor is setting up this question, what is a witch? And offers a lot of avenues to explore that question based on history and based on the fantastic ideas. But as people move upstairs, it's upstairs that we explore and dive deep into this specific story of Mary Lewis Parsons and Hugh Parsons and set up the story for our guests to experience.
I'm so excited. I really hope that I get the opportunity to come experience this before it's over. Can you tell us, you talked about the daily lives of those in the 1650s. Can you talk us through the daily lives of Mary and Hugh before the accusations began? And what were they like as neighbors and community members?
Yes. So Springfield's story is quite unique, especially when you compare it to other colonial settlements in New England at that time, because it was settled as basically a company town. It was designed for trade. And so it wasn't this transplanted congregation like so many other early settlements at that time. And so what that meant is that the people who moved here didn't automatically have that communal relation that many other communities had. When Mary Lewis, when she first moved to Springfield, she worked with William Pynchon's daughter, Anne Smith, taking care of some of their daughters, some of the Smith children. And Hugh Parsons was actually recruited specifically by Pynchon and other town leaders because he had a very important skill, which was brickmaking. Now, at a time when most houses were made of wood, it makes a lot of sense that bricks were a hot commodity, so to speak. And it was important, and it basically elevated the town's status to have this brickmaker in town. And brick chimneys became a status symbol quite quickly. The problem was, so the town needed Hugh because they needed Hugh's skills. But Hugh Parsons was a bit of a character by all accounts. He had a tendency to do what at the time were called sleeveless errands, which is basically an unexpected visit to a neighbor without a real reason. There's many, many records and memories of him basically just showing up at neighbors' houses, and they would answer the door, ask what he wanted, but he was just filling time and space, and it didn't really fit the societal expectations of behavior in colonial New England. And in her own way, Mary Parsons was also somewhat of a known entity in Springfield because she was a deeply religious woman and very devout in her faith. But she, in this story, she basically tried to find the answers to all of these mysterious happenings in Springfield herself. And she thought that she had found it in one of her neighbors, Mercy Marshfield. But that earlier accusation actually wasn't taken by William Pynchon and the rest of the town as a true witchcraft accusation, even though it was taken as slander. And Mercy Marshfield brought slander charges against Mary Parsons. And that meant not only did the debt of the Parsons family increase, but that meant that everyone in town started wondering, why is Mary Parsons asking questions about witches? Why does Mary Parsons know so much about witchcraft? And so they were normal people, the Parsons. They had their own hopes and dreams, and both Mary and Hugh moved to Springfield for new opportunities. But because of many situations and many details that all added up, they found themselves being accused of witchcraft.
How did the rumors and sort of whispers of witchcraft turn into full-blown accusations that consumed the town?
Yes. In the exhibit, Witch Panic, Massachusetts Before Salem, the second floor of this exhibit that I've explained is actually organized in a way that we present that question to our guests. So we introduce Springfield in 1650s, and we introduce the real people involved in this story. But then we invite our visitors to review the evidence themselves. And the space is organized that we break down each of the accusations into different pieces of evidence. And then it's organized chronologically. Some of these details aren't really defined to a specific time, like Hugh's sleeveless errands. They happened a lot. And Mary Parsons' devout faith and her feelings on witchcraft spanned time. But there were other pieces of evidence that were very specific. And the exhibit is organized so that guests are invited to act as the grand jury, and they're actually invited to pass judgment themselves before the ultimate end of the story is revealed. And as you experience this exhibit, there's 15 pieces of evidence that are outlined throughout the space, and it can be pinpointed to beginning in 1648 with the deaths of two of the Smith children, Sarah and Margaret Smith. They died in June of 1648, and the Smith children were William Pynchon's granddaughters, and they fell ill. The entire town prayed, but they passed. And that bothered people in the town, because if these were the town's founders' granddaughters, so in a sense, if they were not safe from this illness and mysterious evil, no one was. And so over the course of almost 3 years, these events were unfolding in Springfield and around the area. And people wanted to know, why are owls mysteriously missing? Why are people going to sleep and seeing visions every night? These questions kept building and building over time until basically they blew up and led to the accusations of Mary and Hugh Parsons.
This story is really gripping. And when you start talking about those 15 evidences and then open with the illness, that is something that we see across history in a lot of these stories. But there is so much more to it, as you mentioned. The culture of the community, why they're there, why are they brought together, and all of the things. I can't imagine how impactful this exhibit is actually to your guests and the community, because you're taking what they think they know or what they enjoy about pop culture with evidences they've heard about, but getting to walk through that story, that's amazing. And one of my favorite parts of the story on the lighter side, even though it was very serious, is the pudding. How the pudding turns out. I just love that. Is that included in the exhibit?
Yes, of course. The spoiled pudding. just so everyone's on the same page. On February 21st, 1651, so this was only 6 days before Hugh Parsons was arrested, 5 days before Mary Parsons was arrested, the Langdon family, Hannah Langdon, tried to make a kind of pudding, and it didn't come out. It was called a bag pudding, and it basically didn't come out of the bag as one whole piece like it's supposed to. It was split from end to end, and the quote is, as if a knife had cut it. And it was this split pudding that just was adding to this suspicion. But that story, I thought, was very important to include because it's an instance where you can see how the social standings of the Parsons worked against them, because the pudding failed and the Langdons actually decided to conduct a bit of witchcraft themselves and threw a bit of the failed pudding in the fire. This was not something you were supposed to do in Puritan Massachusetts, but they wanted answers. And supposedly the first person to knock on your door is the witch who cursed that pudding. But the first person who knocked on the door was Bess Sewell, a different neighbor. And so the Langdons basically just decided that Bess really wasn't the one who did the bread pudding. And so the story goes that Bess came in and they basically all huddled in the house and waited for another knock on the door. And under the cover of dark, they heard some shuffling outside of the door. And who knocked on the door but Hugh Parsons?
Yeah. It sounds like there was an awful lot of evidence presented against them, evidence of witchcraft, evidence of at least odd behavior, eccentricity, definitely. But a lot more testimonies were submitted than what you get even in some of the Salem cases. It's one person making the accusation, and then maybe you get a second person before they do the conviction, but it's only a couple things and they're ready to convict you. Where Springfield, it sounds like they were kind of reluctant to get a case going, and it took like all of this to build up.
Yes. And I wonder if the Mary Louise Parsons accusation of Mercy Marshfield plays a part of that, because before that accusation, people might have felt things about Mary Parsons, but they weren't speaking openly about why does she know so much about witchcraft. And in Puritan New England, you were expected to adhere to some strict societal expectations. But if you point out other people's transgressions of those quote unquote rules, then you're all the more likely to be the target of that scrutiny yourself. And so it was this back and forth and balancing act. In 1645, which is the year that the Hugh and Mary got married, the town of Springfield only had about 100 people in it. And we've all been in situations amongst 100 people. And that's not a lot of people, but rumors and these feelings of just unease can spread really easily. And it was one of those situations that bad things were happening and they wanted to know who was responsible.
The way rumors spread in like a small group, it just reminded me of, work, school. We know how rumors spread in even the smallest workplace. People are gossiping about each other. So, we can all relate to some degree.
Very much so.
Earlier, you mentioned this book that was banned. Can you tell us about that? And did Cotton Mather have it too? Or what's the story on that?
Yes, there are 2 objects displayed in this exhibit. One of them is a pewter candlestick that William Pynchon owned because he also founded Roxbury before he moved out west to Springfield. But the other object is a book called The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption. And this was William Pynchon's publication. William Pynchon, his trade, he was a tradesman and was quite a wealthy man and was also very powerful. As I said, Springfield was founded differently than other colonial towns. But what that meant is that Springfield was essentially William Pynchon's company town. He ran it. He oversaw everyone's debts, and he invited people to live there, but he also served as the town magistrate. And so he was very wealthy and powerful, and Springfield was his town. But he was also very educated, and he fancied himself a bit of a theologian, an amateur one. And it was the mid-1600s. The printing press had made a massive impact in Europe when it comes to the spread of information. And so pamphlets started becoming much more prevalent because they were easier to produce en masse. And so William Pynchon, amateur theologian, decided to write what he titled The Meritorious Price of Our Redemption. And the book itself is an analysis and arguments relating to the death of Christ. Pynchon was arguing that the death of Jesus Christ in the Christian religion, it was not Jesus's death that gave Christians their everlasting life and freed everyone from original sin, but rather it was Jesus Christ's strict adherence to the words of his Father. So it was placing the role of the Father and the Son much more prevalent in the story of Christ and Christian foundings. However, the Puritan leaders of Massachusetts did not like this interpretation at all. And in fact, it was originally published in London, and it immediately started drawing attention. And by the time it arrived on the shores of New England, it faced the judgment of Boston General Council, and they found the text to be heretical. And so the text became one of the first banned books in English North America, and it was burned on the shores of Boston, which means that there are not many copies left that exist in the world. To our understanding, there are only 9 that exist, and the Springfield Museums is lucky enough to have one. And this book is important for all of the reasons I just explained, but it intersects with this story in 2 ways. The first way is the fact that William Pynchon himself was accused of heresy, which meant that he had to face the Boston judges himself. We haven't dove deep into the specifics of Mary and Hugh's story, but their case started in Springfield and eventually had to be moved to Boston, in part because of the large scale of the accusations, but in part because also William Pynchon, after his publication and his book was banned, his status in the Commonwealth started to falter. People started wondering, is he really a good leader if he's publishing heretical texts? And so Mary Lewis Parsons faced the Boston General Court in May of 1651. And that happened in the morning. And it was that very same afternoon that William Pynchon faced accusations of heresy for the book publication. And so essentially, William Pynchon went to Boston, and in the morning, he served as prosecutor against Mary Lewis Parsons for the witchcraft and murder trial. And then in the afternoon, he basically switched sides and was the defendant in his own case. And because of the outcome of the book burning, he was ordered to basically apologize and take it back. He actually basically withdrew from his role as a leader of Springfield. And within a year, he left Springfield and passed off all of the leadership roles to his son-in-law. And this witchcraft trial directly impacted the trajectory of Springfield because it led to the founder of Springfield leaving, which, of course, changed what might have happened. And so these 2 stories of the book and the witch trial, you cannot separate. They're directly intertwined. But another reason why this book is important and so special is because the copy that we have on display at the Springfield Museums was once owned by Cotton Mather. And the way we know that is that he signed it in the cover, and he dated it 1673. And obviously, I can't say this for certain, but because it was Cotton Mather, and because of that date, it is highly likely that Cotton Mather knew the story of the Parsons and knew what happened to William Pynchon as he was entering the phase of Salem.
1673, Cotton Mather was a kid at that time. I believe he was born about 1663. So, yeah.
Yes, and
But he got an early start at Harvard, though.
yes. And I found it fascinating. He signed his name in like the Latin version, and so he added some like OUS to the end of his names.
Cottonus Mather.
Yes. That is so awesome.
I love it.
Yeah. And you brought up Salem. How do you see impacts from this history? I'm also curious what kind of feedback you get from guests or colleagues as you're looking at the Parsons story and then thinking about Salem as well.
So, as I'm sure many of us have heard already, in Malcolm Gaskell's book, The Ruin of All Witches, he argues, and in all of my research, I also argue that what happened in Springfield is quite unique when you compare it to earlier accusations of witchcraft, because this is not the first accusation of witchcraft in Massachusetts, but it's the first time that this panic and this sense of terror and fear that was being funneled towards witches and finding the source of witchcraft, it overtook the town completely. I mentioned that there's 15 pieces of evidence. That's only a sampling of what was provided. I couldn't fit everything because of space and just focus, and I was trying to streamline the story. And so in the story, in Springfield in 1651, you have the first witch panic in what became the United States. And that sets up the scene for every other mass panic relating to witches that came after. And so what happened to Springfield and what happened to the Parsons laid the groundwork, essentially, that ultimately led to and essentially concluded with the Salem witch trials.
I also want to put Springfield into a little bit of context with you. You mentioned the witch trials that happened just before the Hugh Parsons and Mary Louise Parsons case came up. Springfield is in the Connecticut River Valley. So it's just up the river from towns like Windsor, Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, where Windsor had the first execution for witchcraft just in 1647 of Alice Young. And then you go over to Boston, and there's, I believe, 3 women are executed before the Parsons go to trial. There's Margaret Jones, Elizabeth Kindle, and Alice Lake over there. So there were a few, but they were all, like you said, they were one suspect, not a group of suspects, like what you see in Springfield, which is why it's considered a panic. But geographically, it's in like a fertile area where a lot of like witchcraft suspicions are being bandied about at the time. Yeah.
It adds to that sense of unease because there were indigenous communities surrounding Springfield, and that's a large reason why it was economically successful in the fur trade because of the extraction of natural resources. But it was also quite isolated from Hartford and Windsor, and it was 100 miles away from Boston. And it was isolated from other European formed communities. And so that added to this sense of unease because it was quite remote and it was a small town trying to survive.
I'm so happy, even though I've been there and I can just, what I know of the history and what you've shared about what you've put together. I love the journey you're taking guests on to learn about the local history and to understand these accusations more. How do people feel when they're leaving? Is it like, because it is a sad story,
Mhm.
but it also helps us understand ourselves more. What kind of reflections are people coming out?
Yes, it depends on which part of the exhibit, because the entire exhibit is designed to be interactive, both physically in sections, but also mentally and get you thinking, basically. And when it comes to the first floor area, this question of what is a witch, there are a lot of opportunities for individuals to explore that question, because I thought throughout this story, I wanted to center the humanness of the Parsons, because in doing all of this research and exploring their story, it's so easy to see them as witches because that's how history remembers them. But they were human beings first. And so that's why I thought it was important to explore Springfield in 1650s. What is the reality of the setting behind this witchcraft trial? And it's through that setting that we can explore questions like, where did the pointy hats come from? What about the cauldrons and these broomsticks? And so when it comes to the first floor of the exhibit and the question, what is a witch? We're getting a lot of interaction and responses with people engaging with that idea and that question. And they're maybe asking themselves about what makes their favorite witch from pop culture a witch versus, say, another sorcerer or sorceress. And that's one level of interaction and reflection we've been getting. But as the story continues to the second floor and focuses on the Parsons story, I thought, just like how we continued the what is a witch conversation to the present day with exploration of pop culture, I thought it was important to extend the conversation about what happened to the Parsons to now as best as possible. And so the story of after the evidence is laid out and we reveal what happened to the Parsons, there's a wall that's dedicated to the names of all of the individuals that were accused of witchcraft in Massachusetts.
That makes me so happy to hear.
Yes, and we've capitalized and bolded Mary Louise Parsons' names and Hugh Parsons' name, but there are only two names in this sea of names, and every single name has a story like this. And every single name was a person with goals and hopes and dreams whose life was impacted by this fear. And ultimately, the conclusion of that space ends with a detail about how this was first reported by The Guardian. And in 2019, 3 Indigenous young women two of them were expelled, and one of them was left with a warning by their local Arizona school because they did some of their traditional ceremonial practices and the school found it to be satanic. And so this fear of difference and otherness is still very much around and present nowadays. We think of witches as something either in the movies and TV or something in colonial New England. But the fear and the panic that makes the Parsons story happen the way that it did is still something that we all interact with today.
That's so important that you cover that. There's so much that we need to learn from the witch trials and how our ancestors handled fear. And then you look at a case like that one in Arizona, which is where I happen to live. That's a couple hours drive from here, that school. And it's so terrible. We're so quick to label things as satanic or other or enemy. We need to learn from these witch trials. It's so important.
In the second floor gallery, we also provide a space for our visitors to pass judgment after they've reviewed the evidence against the Parsons. And it's just a simple question. Do you find the defendant, Mary Parsons, guilty or not guilty? Do you find Hugh Parsons guilty or not guilty? And going into this and organizing this exhibit, I was genuinely concerned that people wouldn't answer and engage with that question because of this idea that witches, how could they have believed all of this? But I'm blown away with the responses that we've gotten and these papers that people are writing their answers on. It's very clear that they're engaging with the story. And the thing about museum exhibits is that you need to tell the story in a way that people don't need to read every single detail, but they're still able to take away something. And it's obvious that people are taking away this message.
Well done. Hearing about the components and the scope of the story, that the overall story of what is a witch and the Parsons, you're giving guests an opportunity to relate to what they're familiar with, pop culture, witchcraft, fantasy. And then there's this education piece. Here's a story about people just a little couple centuries back who lived here and what happened in the community. And then your final, they're giving more reflection, giving them a story out of the news that they're probably familiar with, not necessarily, but they can go read more. And it's just there's so many great ways to bring people to understand witchcraft accusations. And I really love what you've done. So I'm so appreciative. You mentioned that this was a first large exhibit like this in your community. And I really think as far as what is available here in the US, it's a first because it's very different. It's a different presentation. And I'm so grateful that you have it going until this fall. Thank you to you and your team for giving this really creative presentation in your museum. And I love what museums have the opportunity to do. And so thank you.
Thank you for all of those very kind words. That means a lot because you guys are the expert when it comes to these stories. And as I said before, as you're reading the stories of the Parsons, what drew me in was their humanity, the fact that Mary Lewis was first married around the age of 17, and her first husband abandoned her, but she wasn't able to get a divorce, and how she fought in the ways that she could to establish this new life in Springfield, and how Hugh Parsons had this vision of his life and how he wanted it to go. And it makes all of the details very human. And so throughout the exhibit, we're striving to bring that humanity first. And so the introduction to the exhibition on the second floor is actually two silhouettes, two outlines that represent Mary Lewis Parsons and Hugh Parsons, because I thought it was important for you to be greeted with their humanity first, and then you can hear the accusations against them after you've, quote unquote, met them as people.
Yeah, I mean, I just love what you're doing with bringing the humanity forward. That's what we try to do with the show, is to show that both the accused and the accusers were humans like us. They had the same wants and needs and desires and fears. And, they respond in a lot of the same ways that we respond to things.
Thanks for answering this question with your work. Is there anything else you would like to share today?
I just want to say again, thank you both for having me here. You're doing very important work because, as we've covered, witch trials might not happen anymore, but the fear and the panic and this sense of unease that is often perpetuated is very much still in our society. And so thank you for the work that you do in trying to have these conversations and bring attention to the fact that the people in the past are human and just like us.
Thank you so much for being here and talking to us today. Can you just remind the audience when the exhibit is running and how they can get tickets and all that.
Witch Panic, Massachusetts Before Salem is at the Wood Museum of Springfield History, which is one of the 5 museums at the Springfield Museums. So if you're interested, I would invite you to visit www.springfieldmuseums.org to learn more about our exhibit, but also our many museums and all of the amazing programs we have to offer. The exhibit itself is open until November 2nd. So there is, if you're coming through the area over the summer and into the fall, there's plenty of time to learn a little bit more about Springfield and step foot in what Mary and Hugh Parsons might have experienced.
Don't forget to try out our new podcast, The Thing About Salem. It's perfect for listening to on your ride over to Springfield.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.